Changing a country isn't easy, but change is inevitable. And the choices we make today will shape our country for generations to come. That's why we've published our first book from Australia Institute Press. What's the Big Idea offers 32 ideas for a better Australia, from leading thinkers such as Bob Brown, Sally McManus, Dr. Emma Shortis, and Professor Brian Schmidt. The essays are a roadmap and a reminder that the solutions exist. Australia just needs the courage to implement them. Visit australiainstitute.org.au or follow the link in the show notes to order your copy of What's the Big Idea today.
After America is made on the lands of the Kure, Wurrung, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, we acknowledge that they and their ancestors have cared for the lands, rivers and sea, and all living creatures for thousands of generations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hello, I'm Angus Blackman, and this is After America. On Friday in the United States, the world saw some shocking scenes in the White House. Shocking even in the context of this extraordinary 6-week presidency. Donald Trump wanted Ukraine's Vladimir Zelensky to sign an economic agreement, giving America access to Ukrainian natural resources. But more than 3 years into the country's defense against the illegal Russian invasion, the Ukrainian president wanted security guarantees. The US administration reportedly said that that would come later and expected Zelensky to sign the deal.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now.
But Zelensky said no. And what followed was a diplomatic incident that is reverberating around the world. Donald Trump and one of his far right-hand men, Vice President J.D. Vance, had a heated argument with the Ukrainian leader in front of the press. Well, at least the press that Donald Trump still allows in the building.
Do you disagree that you've had problems bringing people into your military? And do you think that it's respectful to come to the Oval Office of the United States of America and attack the administration that is trying to prevent the destruction of your country?
You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III. If you didn't have our military equipment, this war would have been over in 2 weeks.
In 3 days, I heard it from Putin. In 3 days. This is something
maybe
new.
less.
Vance and Trump berated the Ukrainian leader, demanding that he show more respect.
Offer some words of appreciation for the United States of America and the president who's trying to save your country.
You have to be thankful. You don't have the cards.
For the United States' traditional allies in Europe, a new reality is dawning. And it turns out that many Australians aren't feeling thankful either. According to new Australia Institute research, many are scared about Trump and his vision for the world. Published today, the polling shows that more Australians think that Donald Trump is the greatest threat to world peace, more than Chinese President Xi Jinping or Russian President Vladimir Putin. Joining me to discuss the research is Australia Institute Director of International and Security Affairs, Dr. Emma Shortis. Hi, Emma.
Hi, Angus.
So, Emma, can you tell us how significant you think these results are?
I think these results are really significant, Angus. I think they indicate that there is potentially, at least, a huge shift underway in how Australians think about America, largely or almost entirely driven by the Trump presidency, the second version of the Trump presidency. So, as you said in that intro, we asked Australians who they thought was a greater threat to global security. And out of 3 options, 27% of respondents chose Putin, 27% chose Xi, and 31% chose Donald Trump.
Wow.
Which it's just extraordinary, because what that means effectively is that 1 in 3 Australians now view the leader of our most important security ally and the world's most important democracy as a bigger threat to world peace than the leaders of the world's 2 most powerful authoritarian states. Like, that is wild. And these results came even before that extraordinary meeting in the White House between Trump and Vance and Zelensky. But I think, what they are is reflective of a much bigger shift across the world in how people see the United States and how they are thinking about global security. So these results, looking at how Australians think about America, are lining up with thinking that's changing in America's other traditional allies, especially, of course, in Europe, and a change that was underway again before this meeting.
World leaders gathering in London to show support for Ukraine after that dramatic meeting in the Oval Office.
Those willing will intensify planning now with real urgency. The UK is prepared to back this with boots on the ground and planes in the air, together with others. Europe must do the heavy lifting.
The man who will likely become Germany's next Chancellor, Friedrich Merz of the Conservative Christian Democrats, has publicly questioned the future of NATO with Donald Trump in the White House. Merz admitted the United States is largely indifferent to the fate of Europe.
Die absolute Priorität aus meiner Sicht ist, dass sich die...
My absolute priority will be to strengthen Europe as quickly as possible, so that step by step we can really achieve independence from the United States.
So in Denmark, for example, nearly half of Danish people now see the United States as a threat, as more of a threat than North Korea or Iran. And just in the last few days, the incoming German Chancellor has said that Germany is going to pursue more independence from the United States. And he said himself that he couldn't believe that he, was having to say this.
So, Emma, do you think this, I suppose, means that Australians are starting to think about the United States differently overall?
I think so. And I think that Australians are also starting to think about our own interests in relation to the United States and the alliance quite differently. So one of the other questions that we posed was whether Australians might think that Australia's interests are better served by a closer alliance with the United States, which is, of course, is what we're doing with the things like the AUKUS submarine pact, or whether they think our interests would be better served by a more independent foreign policy. And again, the results that we got back from that question are pretty wild. So 2 in 4 Australians, about 44%, prefer a more independent foreign policy, compared to only 35% who prefer a closer alliance with the United States. And 1 in 5 people, about 22%, don't know or aren't sure. So even the fact that that many people are unsure now, I think, is really significant. And again, marks just, how much upheaval Trump is causing in the United States' traditional allies and how they're thinking about the United States. Because, of course, Australia has historically relied on the United States for its security, and Australians historically have placed a lot of faith in the United States. And it looks, at least now, from these results, like that's shifting pretty dramatically.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I want to get into some more of the results in just a second, but can you tell me a little bit about the polling itself? Polling doesn't have the best reputation in the world after the 2016 election, but I wanted to know, I guess, how reliable this information is.
Yeah, sure. So this is really reliable polling. It's based on Australia Institute research, and we surveyed a representative sample of 2,000 Australians. So we asked them about President Donald Trump, about security and the US-Australia alliance. And this polling is done to the highest Australian standards. It's Australian Polling Council compliant. And all of the results to the questions we asked are outlined on our website. They're available on our website and in the show notes as well. And I just emphasize to listeners, if you're going to go and have a look at these results, to keep in mind that this was done before that meeting with Zelensky. So it doesn't even kind of take into account the extraordinary developments that have unfolded over the weekend. So I suspect that, potentially if we did this polling again, in a few weeks or even a few months, that the results might be even bigger.
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be really interesting to see what effect that meeting has had. In the poll, people were asked about whether or not they feel more or less secure since Donald Trump was elected. What did they tell you?
So they told us that generally, I think Australians are feeling pretty insecure, and that's a direct result really of Donald Trump's presidency and what Donald Trump is doing. So half of Australians, 49% of Australians, feel less secure since the US presidential elections in November. And I guess the flip side of that is that only 17% of Australians feel more secure since the election of Donald Trump. So it's a pretty big gap.
So one of the things I think that meeting in the Oval Office with Zelensky and Trump really kind of highlighted was, I guess, a growing uncertainty about how reliable people see the United States as a partner, particularly when it comes to security issues. What did you find out from the polling about that?
Yeah, look, I think, again, Australian thinking is very much lining up with thinking in Europe, coming from, European people and European leaders. And we did ask this very specific question, if Australians thought that President Donald Trump would defend Australia and defend Australia's interests if we happen to be threatened. And again, half of Australians are not at all confident that Donald Trump would defend Australia or our interests if we were threatened, compared to only 16% who are very confident that he would do so. And I think, this is reflective of Australians listening to what Donald Trump is telling us, particularly, you mentioned Zelensky and Ukraine, Angus, like Trump has been signaling, or Trump and the people around him have been signaling for a really long time, that they weren't particularly interested in defending Ukrainian democracy or Ukrainian interest. And this meeting in the Oval Office, as shocking as it was, is not surprising in the rhetoric and the actual policy positions that are coming out of the White House, particularly from J.D. Vance, who's been really adamant about this for a really long time. So, this makes it clear that Australians are hearing that and understanding what it means. And I think it's pretty significant to contrast these results where half of Australians aren't confident that the United States would come to Australia's defence if we needed it, with the Australian Prime Minister's recent comments on television that he is confident that the United States would defend Australia's interests.
Do we have a guarantee that the US would defend us as an ally?
We do, because we have an ANZUS agreement, an alliance with the United States.
And you think that's rock solid?
Yes.
So I just wanted to pick up on that security guarantee. So there's a, I guess, common misconception that is a guarantee to come to the defence of Australia in the event of an invasion or something like that. But that's not quite true, is it, Emma?
No, it's not quite true, and it's never been true, Angus. So this idea comes out of the ANZUS Treaty, which is the security agreement that Australia has with the United States that was signed all the way back in 1951. And since then, really, Australian defence and security policy has assumed that the United States will come to Australia's rescue if we ever need them. But the ANZUS Treaty doesn't provide any such guarantee. What it says is that the parties agree to act in the event of a threat against one of them. And of course, an act can mean anything at all. It can mean like writing a strongly worded letter or saying something at the UN Security Council. It doesn't mean doesn't mean automatically coming to the defence of an ally. And so Australian policy has always, I suppose, been focused on trying to shore up that mythical security guarantee, and has almost always aspired to the kind of actual security guarantee that is provided by the NATO alliance, the same one that the Trump administration has just trashed. So this lack of confidence, coming from Australians about this already mythical security guarantee is, of course, being deeply shaken by what the Trump administration is doing. I think it's a perfectly reasonable reaction to the new reality that we find ourselves in.
Yeah. So what do we know about the Australians who feel less safe since Trump was elected? Do we have any more data on who they might be?
Yeah, we do. We've got some, I think, pretty interesting breakdowns of that data, Angus, some of which is not particularly surprising. So the one that really stood out to me for probably obvious reasons is that most women, so most Australian women, feel less secure since the election of Donald Trump. So 56% of women feel less secure, compared to only 13% who feel more secure. And, again, there are pretty obvious reasons for that, not the least of which that Donald Trump has been found liable in a civil court for sexual assault, because of the way he speaks about women and the way that his administration is treating women and their rights. So that result is not surprising, but it's still pretty striking and has some pretty significant implications, I think, for domestic politics. I guess the flip side of that is that 22% of men agreed that they felt more secure since the election of Donald Trump. So you can see a pretty clear and, again, fairly unsurprising gender gap there that's reflected in the domestic United States as well.
And you saw during the election campaign, Donald Trump really caught, in particular, the young male vote through, podcasts. It was like kind of odiously described as the podcast election, and but going on shows like Joe Rogan. Do you think that's a similar sort of cohort to the people who are responding in this survey, or is that too hard to say?
Look, I mean, I think it's hard to say definitively, but instinctively I would think that, that is absolutely what's going on. And I think it's clear that, in Australian domestic politics, that the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, feels that as well. He's been going on podcasts and talking about how young men are being overlooked for things, pointing to kind of diversity measures, just as Donald Trump has been doing it, not as brazenly, of course, but it's still the same, a very similar vibe. And I think that, the results around how women feel really reflect that. They reflect a knowledge of whose interests Donald Trump is serving, in the way that he talks about women in his policies to women. And, many women were pointing out on social media, for example, that as, Trump was humiliating and berating Vladimir Zelensky, Andrew Tate, the serial misogynist who was facing human trafficking charges in Romania, was able to leave Romania and land in Florida at the same time, So this is all sending very clear signals to women about who deserves safety and who deserves priority. And, again, even though these results came back before that meeting in the White House, we saw, I think, that kind of hypermasculinity on display, the hypermasculinity of the Trump administration on display, with the way that J.D. Vance turned on Zelensky, the way he was berating him, the way that Trump, touched his shoulder in a kind of show of masculine dominance.
To assert himself over the top. Yeah, it was so awful.
Yeah, it's gross. Like it makes, it's such deeply uncomfortable watching, but that's what it is. It's a display of hypermasculinity. And again, I think these results about, women feeling less safe are a clear acknowledgement of that.
Yeah. And how about by age? What does the polling tell us about how younger Australians are relating to the new Trump administration compared with older ones?
So this was a really interesting result. I guess I have to admit to being a little surprised about this, because there's actually not a huge difference across age cohorts about how secure Australians feel after the election of Donald Trump. In fact, like, more Australians of all ages feel less secure since the election. And really interestingly, older generations are more likely to feel less secure. So I mean, this is my own analysis of it, I suppose. But I think, younger Australians have kind of existed in a world that feels less secure, that already felt less secure. And I think their feelings there are probably reflected in that, whereas older Australians of the kind of boomer generation and perhaps even older are much more used to thinking of the United States as the guarantor of global stability. The United States that won the Second World War, built the UN, established NATO, was the primary architect of the international rules-based order. And so are perhaps feeling even less secure because that America, that version of America, even if it was kind of slightly mythical, is so obviously gone. Donald Trump has so obviously trashed it. And so the change, I think, there, or what I suspect is a big change in how older Australians feel, is probably a reflection of it feeling like a much bigger shift than it might for younger Australians.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe this is extrapolating too far, but I mean, potentially older people are more likely to continue to benefit from the status quo. And I know one of the things that you say in the show, Emma, is that, that the lines we draw between foreign and domestic policy are entirely imaginary, that, younger Australians might be experiencing, inequality at home. They might be less inclined to support the systems that are keeping them down, essentially, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's absolutely right. Young Australians experience, exactly as you said, Angus, economic insecurity, particularly housing insecurity, much more so than older Australians did throughout their lives, with obvious exceptions. I don't want to make too much of a generalisation about it, but I think generally speaking, younger Australians are more aware and more kind of personally impacted by that kind of insecurity, not just economic insecurity, but of course climate insecurity as well, and are looking to a future that's very different from the experience of their parents or their grandparents. And so, maybe I think you're right that's why there's that levelling out, I suppose, of how secure Australians across those age cohorts feel, because again, that kind of shift maybe for older people is bigger because of exactly what you've just described.
Australia and the United States are old allies and true friends. Our nations are bound by a history of shared sacrifice, a commitment to common values, and, above all, enduring respect and affection between our peoples. President Trump has run a campaign based on change, and he's made it clear he's going to do things differently. So we shouldn't be surprised as things change, but equally, we should be really confident in ourselves and our place in the world as well, and our ability to deliver on our interests together as Australians.
On the domestic Australian front, Australia is heading into a federal election really soon. We don't know exactly when at the time of recording, but soon. How do the responses on Trump and our relationship with the United States line up with people's voting intentions in Australia?
So this is another result, Angus, that I don't think is particularly surprising, in a kind of instinctive reading of Australian politics and how, different voters might view the United States. So in answer to that question of whether you feel more or less secure since the election of Donald Trump, about 54% of Labor voters answered that they felt less secure, and 68% of Greens voters answered that they felt less secure, compared to 41% of Coalition voters. So there is, a fairly predictable gap there, I suppose. But interestingly, 49% of independent or other voters also said that they felt less secure. And it was only among One Nation voters that the answer more secure was selected by more people than less secure. That was about 35% to 22%. But while that might not be particularly surprising, in terms of people's voting intentions and how they think about America, I think what it does do is start to test this idea that there's a bipartisan consensus around Australia's alliance with the United States. It's often framed as being bigger than prime ministers and presidents, and that, there's this continuity and this agreement that we need the United States. When, in fact, when you kind of dig down into this data a little bit, there are pretty significant differences across party lines in how people think about America. So, just to give you one example, 48% of Labor voters prefer a more independent foreign policy for Australia, while 49% of Coalition voters prefer that closer alliance with the United States. And again, that's not particularly surprising, but it's hardly a bipartisan consensus. And I think it also, to go to your question about the election, it also points to the potential for internal tensions in both parties around their position on the alliance and Trump in particular. And if we dig even further into that and go back to what we were talking about earlier, Angus, how women feel about the Trump administration in particular might begin to play a role in Australian electoral politics when we think, for example, about contests in inner city seats between women, teal independents and, more small L Liberal coalition candidates. Are there internal tensions there in the Liberal Party, for example, between those more small L Liberal candidates and the more kind of rah-rah Trump candidates, on more towards the other end? So I think it will be really interesting to watch how that plays out and whether that so-called bipartisan consensus on the alliance is starting to crack, maybe.
Yeah, and presumably within the Labor Party as well, right? Like if the government is out there trumpeting the common values, supposed common values that we share with the Trump administration, with Trump's America, but 30% of their voters want a closer alliance, that doesn't seem to quite stack up politically, right?
It doesn't quite stack up politically, hey? And I think, increasingly the Trump administration is highlighting those pretty significant tensions around common values. I think these results show really, really clearly that many Australians, and we need to acknowledge that not all Australians, there is a proportion of Australians who, think Trump's election is a good thing for the United States or a good thing for Australia, for example. But these results do show quite clearly that Australians are recognising, I think, that those common values are being increasingly tested, and particularly increasingly tested by Donald Trump and, his trashing of the international rule of law, in his approach to America's role in the world, in his treatment of America's traditional allies, and of course as well, the stuff he's doing at home. Australians are seeing that and what it means as well. So, for a government to continue to talk about common values with the United States, as the Prime Minister did when Donald Trump was first elected, I think that framing is going to come under increasing pressure.
Yeah. And presumably, I don't know what you think about this, Emma, but presumably the bipartisan consensus is partly because foreign policy just historically isn't, in peacetime at least, the most important thing for most Australians. But potentially Trump's ability to suck up all the oxygen and dominate the news cycle in not just America, but in Australia and other parts of the world might be bumping this kind of up the list for people. What do you think about that kind of proposition, I suppose?
Yeah, look, I think that's true. I think that, as you say, Trump drags all the attention towards him and I think forces people to confront what the United States is doing in the world and the impact of the things Trump is doing on, European and global security. And that's why I think these results reflect that deeper feeling of insecurity in Australia, partly because, more attention is being paid to it. I think, and I think in the past, Australians might have felt they didn't have to pay much attention to the alliance, exactly as you said, because they felt quite secure in it. There was this feeling that the United States was a reliable ally, even for all its faults. And that feeling, I think, is clearly, for very good reason, falling away.
Yeah. And so we've talked a little bit about how Australians not in government are thinking about the Trump administration. To finish up, I wanted to take us back to the government-to-government relationship. Mm-hmm. What do you think all of this means for the future of the alliance?
Again, it's a really difficult question. I think, as I said, there will be increasing pressure on the alliance and increasing pressure on the Australian government in particular to stand up for Australian values in the face of Trump's assault, particularly on the international rule of law, which Australia has a vested interest in, that international rule of law continuing. And I think we've seen that, in the last few days where the PM has talked about particularly Australian support for Ukraine and how that is driven by a commitment to the survival and continuation of the international rule of law. So I think we may see some shifts there. But look, I think the other important thing to remember, and it's hard to remember it because, as you said, Trump sucks all the oxygen out of the room, is that, the alliance isn't just about managing Donald Trump as an individual. And in fact, Australia's relationship with the United States is much bigger than just that alliance, than just that government-to-government relationship. I think Australians are increasingly worried about what is happening in the United States because of that bigger relationship. We're worried because we care. It's not that, Australians want to abandon the United States, which is often how it's framed, I think, when we talk about independent foreign policy or support for the alliance, that it's like this binary choice between going all the way with America or abandoning the alliance altogether.
Or somehow implicitly supporting China.
Yeah, exactly. That we have, a choice between our alliance with America or being completely dominated by China. So that's such a false binary. That's not the way that international relations or the world works. And I think, recognizing that and focusing on that bigger relationship with the United States, that's not just the kind of capital A alliance security relationship, but the genuine kind of democratic connection that we have between our parliament and Congress, or the cultural connections, or, even the sporting connections that we might have. Those things really matter too. And those are, I think, refocusing on those things, on, the cultural relationship, the economic relationship, is a way of continuing and broadening our relationship with the United States that might also contribute more to stability and security. Because, and I've said this before, the collapse of American democracy is not in anyone's interests. It's not in Americans' interests. It's not in our interests. It's not in the world's interests. And I think these results reflect an implicit understanding of that.
Emma, thanks very much for the conversation.
Thanks, Angus. Thanks for stepping in as host.
Pleasure. This episode was recorded on Monday the 3rd of March, and no doubt a bunch of stuff will have changed since then. If you're enjoying After America, please leave us a rating and review on your podcast platform of choice. We'd love to hear from you. You can reach out to us on social media. We're at the Oz Institute, that's with an AUS, on Twitter and Instagram, and at australiainstitute.org.au on Blue Sky. And you can send us feedback and episode ideas via our email address, podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. We'll be back next week. I'm Angus Blackman. Thanks for listening.